Thank you so much, Marty, and welcome everyone this evening to the Bronfman Center of the 92nd Street Y, and I'm referring not just to the people here in New York, but 17 remote locations all over the United States. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. Well, we are living in certainly very interesting and hazardous times for anybody who claims to be or wishes to be thought of as a Zionist. In fact, we could probably say that there are many people who are now practicing their Zionism in secrecy. No longer, in so many ways, do professed Zionists seek to parade their Zionism around or their Zionist affiliations. In fact, I could say that in some ways some of you will recognize the notion that maybe they are Zionist Moranos. After all, there are many examples in our world today of Zionism being thought of as a dirty word. And let me just read you off a small laundry list of things of where there's dirty laundry. Well, first of all, we most recently celebrated in 54 cities around the world Israel Apartheid Week, which was double the number of cities that participated in this event. Israeli sports teams have been met with violent protests in cities around the world, and particularly in Sweden, Spain, and Turkey. Abe Foxman will probably talk a little about the numbers of protests in which the Star of David is equated with a swastika, very common protest on behalf of supporting Palestinians and opposing Zionism. In South Florida, I know we have at least one or two locations in South Florida, but in Boca Raton just several months ago, and I think you can actually see this on YouTube, quite disturbingly, in a protest against Israel's incursion into Gaza, one woman said, "Burn the Jews," and she also followed up by that by saying, "You need a big oven."
Fort Lauderdale.
It's Fort Lauderdale. Okay, Fort Lauderdale, way to go. Mauritania closed its Israeli embassy recently. There are human rights advocates and international judges that are calling for an investigation of Israel's military tactics in Gaza. There are no investigations about Hamas's rocket capability, however. There are, of course, British boycotts of Israeli academics and American universities throughout the country, but particularly located in California. There have been a number of one-sided panels discussing the Palestinian situation and the delegitimization of Zionism. And in those same universities, there are many calls for economic boycotts and divestments. The LA Times, just last week, published an op-ed with the headline, "Zionism is the problem." And tomorrow evening, if you're interested, although you can't get a ticket, sorry, although the tickets are free, at the New York Theater Workshop, Carol Churchill, the British playwright, has her most recent theatrical production. It's only an 8-minute stage reading. It's entitled "7 Jewish Children, a Play for Gaza." I actually will be appearing at the tomorrow night's performance as a post-play commentator. But it's essentially a play in which several Jewish families utter a number of blood libelous comments against the Palestinian people. And one Jewish Israeli utters the following statement: "I wouldn't care if we wipe them out." Roger Cohen, a columnist for the New York Times, recently said that Israel shouldn't, quote, "get too hung up on Hamas's refusal to recognize Israel's right to exist." And here's my favorite before we turn to our more distinguished guests. The Brooklyn Food Co-op, I'm sorry, I just chuckle every time. The Brooklyn Food Co-op, which is located in Park Slope, and for many of you who don't know, Park Slope could very well be America's most liberal voting district in the United States. Could very well be. And it has a very high number of Jewish residents. Recently considered the banning of Israeli produce as a protest. Tomatoes from Gaza, however, are always welcome. I think they didn't actually vote to do this. There was too much of a dissent even among their own ranks, but in fact it was discussed. Here to discuss how and why, and in some ways the absurdity of how it became that Zionism has suddenly become such a dirty word, we have three really fascinating guests, all of whom are my friends. For those of you who follow my series, I never invite an enemy. It's always a good friend. I just rig it. Over there is my good friend Oren Rudavsky. Oren, many may know from his award-winning documentary films. His upcoming film is entitled The Zionist Idea. It should be out in the next several years ago. It's received an NEH grant, and you'll be seeing it in PBS stations all over America. My good friend Oren Rudavsky, as we call the Paul Lynde Center Chair. He's too young to get the reference. Bret Stephens, the Jewish boy wonder. Many people read him, or should read him, on Tuesdays. Today, in fact, he's a weekly columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and there are many reasons to read the Wall Street Journal, but certainly reading Bret Stephens on Tuesday is the finest reason of all. And just to demonstrate why I called him the boy wonder, before he came to the Wall Street Journal, he was the editor of the Jerusalem Post, and I think he took over the position just after his bar mitzvah. I'm quite sure. He spent 4 years, and before he was in high school, he was out of that job. And then, of course, a man who never needs any introduction on any stage, anywhere, and we know this because of all of his fans sitting outside on Lexington Avenue. The man is truly a rock star, the executive director for many, many years of the Anti-Defamation League, Abe Foxman. All right, let's get started. Oren, let me just start with you for a moment. Did you have any concerns, or do you have any concerns? Also, I think your co-producer is a good friend of ours, Joe Dorman. Did you and Joe have any concerns about making a documentary for PBS viewing all over the country, perhaps also around the world, about an ideology that people now fundamentally despise and hate?
Well, sure. We had many concerns about it. I mean, my main concern is that we're trying to actually approach the topic. It's called the Zionist Idea for a very clear reason, which is we're trying somehow to make a film about Zionism that avoids today's politics. That's impossible, we know. But I feel like one of the problems with any conversation about Zionism is that people get upset whatever you say about Zionism. So our first concern was that the National Endowment for the Humanities would be upset by anything we had to say. But thankfully they haven't been so far. But I did want to say one thing, which is I think that Zionism is not just a dirty word today. I think it's important to know that Zionism from its inception was a dirty word to many people, and in those days, I think that included many Jews. It included Reform Jews and Orthodox Jews. And as all of us know, the movement started, and I come from a family with a long Zionist tradition, but most Jews, like my family, when they left Russia, they did not go to Palestine. They came to the United States, as did 95% of the Jews who left Russia. So although many Jews in Russia might have been Zionists, most of them, that did not mean they would go to Israel. So our film is trying to look at it from the idea where it began and how it began. And we think that's important because otherwise all you get into is an argument with either the people outside or the people in this room, or, it's impossible to have a reasonable conversation unless you really understand what Zionism was and what's happened to it.
Did the NEH make any requirements, any demands that you try to stay away from the politics of our time?
We had many conversations with the program officer there, who was incredibly supportive of the proposal, and the National Endowment for Humanities certainly tries to stay out of current politics. And it's the humanities, after all, and humanities doesn't concern itself with, or tries not to, with the politics of the moment. So it has to be something that has been considered by historians or philosophers or thinkers of that sort. So the key question for us is, what's the date where officially we stop telling the story? And that was one of the conversations, is where does the story begin? Does it begin 2,000 years ago? Does it begin with the Bible? Does it begin with Herzl or his predecessors? Does it begin in 48, or does it and then where does it end? And many of our scholars said, well, it ends in 48, or it ends in 67. So we didn't end it there. We do bring it, at least initially, to, it's impossible to tell the story without saying what Ahmadinejad and other critics have to say about Zionism. But that was one of the big questions.
Abe, you've devoted your life to tracking anti-Semitism. Is tracking anti-Semitism the same thing as tracking anti-Zionism?
I believe so. I'm convinced that it is. It was Martin Luther King who, in answer to a question from a student, a hostile question in Harvard, challenging Zionism, who said very clearly, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's always been clear to many of us, but Zionism was made, or attempted to be made, a dirty word by the Soviets. Not necessarily. In the Jewish community, Zionism, Oren, was a debate. That is, it was threatening to some. It was religiously premature, but it was a debate. It was never a dirty word. It were the Soviets who, in their attack against Jews, to isolate Jews, that began to refer to Jews as Zionists, conspiratorial, part of an international cabal, loyalty elsewhere. That's when it began to take on the form of a pseudo-anti-Semitism. Instead of saying you're against Jews, or in classical terms, you camouflaged it. Now, ironically, the Soviet Union is no longer around, and what they really, in a way, perfected was later taken over by the Arabs, pro-Arabs, anti-Israel, politically, the UN, et cetera, and now it's just a euphemism for Jews.
Bret, you cover global affairs. Should Israel care what the rest of the world thinks? I mean, it seems like Israelis tend to be a nerd after all these decades of hostile global criticism. I mean, they figure, look, the world hates us, what are we supposed to do? But should they care that Zionism is treated with such an incredible amount of contempt and disrespect? Nobody says that about Democrats and Republicans, but Zionists, now you have to sort of hide your affiliation.
Well, I'm tempted to say they shouldn't care, and I'm tempted to say that often Israel pays much too much attention to what the rest of the world thinks, or what the rest of the world, Europe, the Arab neighbors, statements by the UN, so on, that there is some real strength to be gained by tuning that out. But of course the Israelis should care, because Israel exists as part of a Jewish continuum. It is not simply divorced from the reality of Jewish history prior to 1948. Israel does, in a sense, speak for Jews everywhere. Ultimately, the concept of legitimacy in political life matters. And usually it's taken for granted. Sovereign states are sovereign no matter what. Germany committed the greatest atrocities of human history, or some of the greatest atrocities of human history. No one said we should end Germany. The Chinese did atrocious things during the Cultural Revolution and before that. No one questions China's right to exist. Various Arab states have each committed atrocities on an incredible scale. No one questions their right to exist. In the case of Israel, this theme comes up constantly, incessantly, by our friends on Lexington Avenue, for example. And this matters because Israel is ultimately a fingerling of a state that depends to some extent on belonging in a community of nations. The question of its belonging is not only a dangerous one, but it's ultimately internally corrosive. if someone is questioning your right to exist constantly, you will ultimately, or some portion of the body politic will, and in fact has, come to question that right to exist as well. You take the view, it's a kind of Stockholm syndrome writ large, you take the view of the people who are aiming at your destruction or your harm. And that's been a process that's been at work certainly within the Jewish community in the diaspora, to some extent in Israel itself, and it has to be addressed and countered very forcefully. And if not, it becomes, I think, a cancer for Israel.
But Thane, I think it's more of an issue in diaspora than it is in Israel. In Israel, I don't think they question or challenge or their being, their existence. And I don't think, they see the challenges, but they see it in terms of Hamas, they see it in Hezbollah, Iran, more than anything else. They don't see a challenge to who they are, what they are, and their being from those who question their legitimacy. They get up in the morning, they know who they are, they know they're legitimate, they are a state, etc. And in fact, in Israel, if anything, the debate is, are we in a post-Zionist era? Have we fulfilled the dream by the moment of establishing the state? Do we have to be Jewish? How Jewish do we have to be? What is the Zionist idea, or the idea that you're going to, historically? And they're more philosophical, theological, political arguments. In the diaspora, however, it has become a dirty word because of the use. It's the euphemism. Anti-Semitism, even anti-Semites will tell you they're not anti-Semites. Arabs will tell you very quickly, how can we be anti-Semites? We are Semites ourselves. So even those they know, and so Zionism has become the pseudonym, the camouflage. And that has impacted on Jews. I remember when the United Nations called Zionism racism, that thousands of American Jews marched on the street wearing buttons, I am a Zionist. We went down throughout the 30s. I'm not sure that today, if the same thing happened and we called a rally to ask Jews, diaspora Jews in Paris, in Copenhagen, in London, or New York to march as Zionists, that they would be willing to stand up as we did in the 70s. And I think it's impacted more on our self-image in diaspora. And in a way, we've permitted it to become a dirty word.
Well, look, just very briefly in response to that, I think you're right. In the main, most Israelis are not, certainly, anti-Zionism is essentially an aggression against oneself. But I hate this to use the metaphor of cancer, but just briefly, your body doesn't have to be overwhelmed by cancer in order to succumb to cancer. There are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who have quietly slipped away from Israel. Some of them feel very warmly toward Israel, some left for economic reasons or whatever, but they've just sort of walked away from the Zionist enterprise. I'm glad that you read only the Jerusalem Post and are not reading Haaretz. But to read Haaretz on a daily basis, and in a way, Haaretz is a great tribute to what Israel is, because who gives it better to the Israeli state than Haaretz itself? To anyone who says that Israel is this, horribly repressive state, they should just look at what Haaretz produces daily. But it is extraordinarily corrosive when you have at least a vocal and well-known group of Israelis who continually assault the Zionist enterprise as an illegitimate enterprise, and who find an echo chamber not just among some elements of diaspora Jewry, but all of the, let's say, the Walt Mearsheimer world that says, how dare you call me anti-Semitic? I am merely quoting what Amira Haas or Gidon Levy said in the pages of Haaretz the other day, and in that sense, that's where they have their grip, and why it's so worrying.
But so much of it is part of inside the Israeli Beltway. We know, we read Haaretz, but that's not really the essence of what makes Zionism a dirty word. Not the fact that Haaretz writes all that stuff. It challenges Israeli policy, Israeli government. It has a problem with what Zionism is all about. But I don't think that's what impacts. None of that, what we saw in the streets of the world capitals, and after during the Gaza war, had nothing to do with Haaretz.
No.
Had nothing to do with our debate. And our debate can be ugly, can become corrosive. Some of it is religious in nature. Some of it is very, very extreme politically, but that's not what it's all about. It's another issue, Bret. It's another issue. Israel struggles with those issues, but that's not what's outside in the street.
I'll tell you, I mean, we can go on about this forever, and Abe and I agree on 99%, so you've struck on the 1% where we
That's
disagree.
what we're about here at the
He said
92nd Street Y. We're always looking for that 1% that no one else will get, nowhere.
I am persuaded that a great deal of the anti-Zionism that exists today in the world, and it's anti-Zionism that has swiftly plunged into anti-Semitism, exists because Jews themselves have given it the permission, in effect, to exist. Walt and Mearsheimer get away with a book like The Israel Lobby because there's just enough by way of a veneer of Jewish respectability for them to say, how dare you call us anti-Semites? That is extremely important. And why is it that racism, okay, is absolutely a dirty word in this country? And it's because the black population, the African American population in America, finally stood up and said, we will not be traduced. We will not be defamed. We will not sit there while you issue coded racist messages and say, well, maybe that was racist, maybe that wasn't. The conversation that exists among Jews, and I'm talking about Jews sort of in this audience, is this extremely sort of, there's a tendency to make these wonderfully fine distinctions. You know, was that anti-Israel? Is that anti-Zionist? Is that anti-Semitic? What was the intention? I mean, it's maybe a reflection of a kind of legalistic.
And you're saying African Americans wouldn't do it?
They
would see racism
that
for
among
racism.
African Americans, there's an expression of "you're an Uncle Tom," and that's a very useful expression.
Well, we say you're a self-hating Jew.
Yeah, it can be abused, but anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism exists thanks to the permission of Jews who have said it is legitimate to speak this way about us.
Well, Oren, it's interesting what this 1% we've been talking about here. If you think about the theme, Abe says that we don't have people who would stand up as they would in 1975 when the United Nations Security Council equated Zionism with racism. Bret is making a similar point about what the respectable, socially acceptable Jewish intellectual on the left would accept and embrace as fashionable and make a kind of Talmudic distinction between, well, that's not exactly anti-Semitism, that's kind of Zionism. You sold PBS on the idea of a long documentary on Zionism. Do you think they must have believed that there's an audience for this stuff and it's not just people who hate Jews or hate Israel or hate Zionism? And do you think it's true that American Jewry or world Jewry have become passive and complacent about their Zionist affiliation?
Well, first let me just clarify that NEH and PBS are not the same thing, so it's quite possible that NEH will fund this film, and the NEH is very open to academic debate, I think, in a way that I think that PBS probably may not be as open, and I'm sure there will be arguments and discussion there. But, you know, I think it's unfair to racism and Zionism to put the two together. I think what blacks feel about racism is a different animal than what Jews feel about Zionism. I mean, the debate is raging because of real events on the ground that are very complicated, and the war in Gaza is obviously a perfect example of how difficult it is to parse what a defensive war, what a provocative war, whether you know, you read the New York Times or let alone Haaretz or whatever else, you know that there's ample fodder for Jews to feel threatened, Jews who are Zionists to feel threatened in defending Israel. And you know, to make this film, I went to Israel. I'm not an expert on Zionism, and I don't pretend to be. So I went and spoke to Jews in Israel there, and the point, and of course in Israel the debate is, the spectrum of the debate is much wider there. It's much more open, and that's a wonderful thing. But I spoke to Aleph Bet Yehoshua, who I know has said some things that are provocative, but one of the things he said is, I don't know if this exactly applies to what we're talking about, but I think one of Israel's greatest problems is that we no longer understand Zionism. The word Zionism has become like ketchup. Everybody pours it on everything. It doesn't clarify anything. It just covers things over. And this causes great confusion, especially among the young. I want the whole country to agree on a single definition. And he goes on to say, the definition of Zionism is quite simple. It is just this, to build a state in the land of Israel, period. And then he goes on one little, some say the occupation of the territories is a betrayal of Zionism. The fact that we are dominating in other people, this means we've betrayed Zionism. Others think that the occupation proves that Zionism is bad to its core, and on and on. And the point is, that's not Zionism. And what we intend to do is find it, you know, look for a definition of what Zionism actually is, not what the Soviets decided after being one of the big supporters of the state in 47, not what they decided in 67 for political reasons, not what in Iran they're deciding for political reasons is expedient of them, nor what the US Senate or Obama or anybody else says Zionism is.
There's an irony. To most Israelis, they don't care about Zionism. They don't see themselves as Zionists. See them as Israelis, as Jews. Most American Jews don't see themselves as Zionists. That the definition of Israelis and Jews, we're being defined by the outside, not by a friendly outside. That means it's the enemies of Jews, it's the enemies of Israel that have labeled us, defined us as Zionists. But in effect, you know, basically, who cares? And the point that I'm making in terms of, I think there's great support for Israel amongst American Jews. And American Jews will come out and march and stand at rallies in behalf and in support of Israel. But when you convert that entity for what we're talking, what is Israel? Israel is Zionism. What is Zionism? The national movement for the liberation of the Jewish people. What is Zionism? It's Jewish states, it's Jewish identity, it's Jewish sovereignty, Jewish independence. All the things that the Jews will march down 2nd Avenue or 4th Avenue or 5th Avenue without any hesitancy. Put that into a context that we're standing up for Zionism, which is the Jewish state, Jewish identity, and you're not going to get the same response because we have absorbed within us some of this discomfort that our enemies have put upon us by that label, which at one time was something we're proud of. And I believe in the diaspora today, it's not something you can sell.
Bret, do you think some of what Abe's saying and perhaps what people are feeling is related not to secular Zionism, but messianic Zionism? The same kind of thing that we opposed about the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, the idea of Islamic fundamentalism, that there's a feeling in the world that Israel is being too disturbingly driven by a kind of messianic Judaism that has a very different vision from the original thinkers of Zionism, and that kind of Jewish fundamentalism is what people are responding to. And I'm thinking more recently about the reports that came out of Israel that some killings of civilians during Gaza may have been related to some rabbinic officers who had a very different, perhaps more warped view of what Israel's military strategy or what its ethical responsibilities are. And I'm wondering whether that's part of the confusion, that we are now trained to be suspicious of anybody who is holding too fast to religious fundamentalism.
That Zionism is basically Baruch Goldstein, is what you're saying.
That's exactly right. That there's a thought that that's what people are responding to, and it's not the Zionism that people absorbed during the 50s and 60s and 70s, but it's a different vision, a different view of it that's not unlike Islamic fundamentalism, and that perhaps there's a confusion about that, and Jews should straighten that out.
Yeah, I mean, that must be part of it. I mean, I'm very, I don't traffic with that form of Zionism, just like there are strains of Americanism, which I want to have nothing to do with either. But I don't think, in the main, the sort of modern critique of Zionism is really a critique of Jewish fundamentalism. I mean, the efforts of Christiane Amanpour, to the contrary notwithstanding. The critique is of choose your prime minister. Sharon, the modern-day Hitler, becomes Olmert, the modern-day Hitler, becomes Barak, formerly known as the great hope of the peace camp. Suddenly, with the Gaza conflict, he becomes the face of the Zionist enterprise. I think it would be easy. It would almost be nice to think that the problem is that Zionism has somehow just become conflated with an extreme sort of chauvinistic Jewishness or Israeliness or religious fervor that turns people off. When people are objecting to Israel, I doubt it's the Baruch Goldsteins that they have in mind. They have the Sabras in their uniforms in mind.
But don't they think of the settler movement that way?
Well,
and since the settler movement seems to be ground zero for so much criticism, even among American and world Jewry.
But I think this is one of the interesting things about what I think we've discovered in the last few years. I mean, most of us could persuade ourselves, or many of us could persuade ourselves, during the period when the occupation included Gaza and not simply the West Bank, but Gaza before the Palestinian Authority was created, that the settlers were the problem, that they gave Israel that ugly face, whether they were religious or not religious, that they were on other people's land. What is interesting is that anti-Zionism has intensified as Israel has conceded and withdrawn from land. I mean, I always find it stunning. People will come up to me and say, Gaza is occupied territory. And I'll say, well, maybe you could make an argument it's blockaded territory, but I don't understand how you can make the argument that it's occupied territory.
Maybe if you're an Egyptian.
That's hilarious. Well, sure. But they will say this. So the trope of occupation kind of stays there as a useful sort of rhetorical alibi.
Whether the Jews are there or not.
But really the objection is to Israel itself. And in a way, I mean, I think any Israeli must feel profoundly betrayed by this idea that, I mean, the deal that was supposed to happen is you Israelis get out of the business of occupation, and then at that point we will defend your right to your sovereign territory to the last man. Did you see this happening in Gaza when the rockets were falling? Did you see missions of Belgian foreign ministers or the dignitaries of Spain who for so long had said, the problem is occupation. Okay, fine. If the problem is occupation, when we get out, we expect your support. But in fact, we get out and we get, on the contrary, a more intensified, more vehement form of anti-Zionism that slips into something increasingly approaching naked anti-Semitism.
Well, there was a short period of time when Israel did withdraw, that there was an openness. Europe turned around for a while because when Sharon withdrew from Gaza, there was a new openness in Europe, but it didn't last long because now when Israel was trying to defend itself, it all of a sudden came back to the old gimmicks. Anti-Semites in the olden days, when they got angry at Jews, they would say, go to Palestine. Now, anti-Semites say, get out of Palestine. So, you're looking for rationale. Israel left occupation, and the world should understand we're not dealing with rational elements. We're not dealing with rational arguments. We're not dealing with a rational analysis. It's bigotry. It's bigotry.
Well, I just want to address 2 points. One is that the idea that Israelis fought differently in Gaza because of religious elements, that it somehow infiltrated or gained control of Israeli government policy, I find completely absurd. I mean, the range, it's an assumption that all religious Jews in Israel are right-wing settlers. It's an assumption that just makes no sense if you know who the religious are in Israel. Sure, there's Baruch Goldstein, but there are many religious Jews on the right and the left, and even within the settler movement, who would not speak that way. And one of the people quoted, Moshe Halbertal, who's an Orthodox Jew, certainly wasn't quite comfortable with Israeli policy, whatever it was, and it's still not clear what it was in Gaza. So that's just one point that I think is important, that the range is wide. And I'm afraid to get involved in the political end of this, but I think the suggestion that being anti-Israel because of Israel's activities in Gaza is pure bigotry is just a little, needs to be more nuanced. I mean, there is, Gaza is controlled by Hamas right now. We know a lot about Hamas, but we also know that conditions are very difficult for Arabs, Palestinians in Gaza who have nothing to do with Hamas, who bore the brunt of many of the attacks.
The demonstrations around the world had nothing to do with the conditions, because if they really cared about the conditions of the poor Palestinians in Gaza, which was a concentration camp before the Vatican called it a concentration camp during the Gaza war. It was a concentration camp under the control of other Palestinians called Hamas. So that if that's really the concern, they had ample opportunity to act out, to speak out, to intervene, to protest in the streets, that they need more this, that. No, but that's not what it was all about. It was about when Israel moved to defend its men, women, and children, that all of a sudden this overwhelming desire to come to the aid of legitimately suffering people. Nobody questions that. So it took on a different level, a different intensity, and it was because Jews were standing up to defend Jews. And again, you've written enough about it. More Muslims were killed every single day by other Muslims in more countries in the world, and why doesn't anybody care? If human life is sacred, and Muslim life is sacred, and we don't for 1 second challenge it, why aren't there demonstrations around the world by all the good people who marched in the streets of London and Copenhagen and Oslo? Why don't they care about the innocent lives of men, women, and children who happen to be Muslims, who are dying because they're being killed by other Muslims? Where is this? Where is this outrage? And at the end of the day, if there is no outrage by the same people who care for human life and even care for Muslim life, which is fine, but only when Jews stand up to defend themselves and victims fall, then it's bias. Then it's not true human concern.
Bret, can you address globally, can you address a little what seemingly Abe has touched upon, this lack of balance, lack of proportion, the notion of the double standard that's applied to Israel? I mean, there are many hot spots around the world. You don't see quite the same amount of world outrage on behalf of the victims of Darfur. There are fewer universities in the United States in the last year that have held conferences about Darfur than they have in the last 2 months about the Palestinians of Gaza. It's a small region of the world, and yet it seems to receive a disproportionate amount of attention. And it may, in fact, be that Israel, on some level, is being held to a much higher moral standard than the rest of the world, since on some level no one seems to care about victims in other parts of the world with the same level of passion and intensity as the world seems to feel with respect to the victims of Gaza.
Yeah, with respect to Darfur, I noted that one of the most vocal groups denouncing the International Criminal Court's indictment of Omar Bashir, the president of Sudan, was Hamas. Hamas is pro the people, the guy who is killing hundreds of thousands of Darfuris. This is a fact. Iran was another group that then supported
Bashir.
Bashir. But Darfur isn't the best example because there are groups who are, there is genuine activism for Darfur. There are a lot of liberals who care a great deal. Liberals, everyone, but let me sort of speak of the left because I think this is where most of the protests come from the so-called progressive community, who care about Darfur. Look at what's happening in Congo. 5 million people have been killed in what used to be known as Zaire, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in the last 6 or 7 years. Is this, again, to Abe's point, all life is equal and life is sacred. Where is this on the international agenda? Someone made the point, Dennis McShane, a very courageous labor parliamentarian in Britain who was in town today, made the point that many more Muslims have been killed in Hindu rioting in India in the last, 10, 20 years, pick your number. But when people speak of India, people say, well, India is a model of tolerance. And indeed it is. I have nothing, India is a wonderful country. But objectively, that we have a fact that thousands of Muslims have been killed. You got a taste of this, anyone who saw the movie Slumdog Millionaire, about what that is about. So why then the disproportion about Israel? Eric Hoffer had a wonderful line, American philosopher of the middle of the 20th century. He said something to the effect that Israel is the only country in the world expected to behave like a Christian nation. Which is a wonderful line. I had my own experience of this. I was once interviewing a European diplomat who was then the European representative in Israel. And I said to him, look, this was back in 2002, maybe. I said, look, Syria has been occupying Lebanon for 26, 27 years. No one knows about this. No one talks about this. But everyone, of course, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, is a top item on the international agenda. Why is that? He said, his answer has stayed with me now for several years. He said, you Israelis, speaking to me, he said, you Israelis, you're one of us. We don't judge you the same way we judge Cambodians or Colombians. And I was stunned by the comment. Because it's essentially a racist comment. Cambodians are incapable of moral agency? Please. Colombians, these are extraordinarily courageous people who've suffered terribly in their respective genocide strife and so on. But it seemed to me interesting because it was a way of elevating Israel in order to denigrate it. And that, in a sense, is precisely what anti-Semites or anti-Zionists do when they employ Holocaust imagery against Jews. Carol Churchill, your play, it all begins with, look, the Jews, they were once these perfect, wonderful victims. They were fantastic. They died by droves, and we felt so sorry for them. And now look what they've become. So you employ, essentially, it's a very clever way of employing Jewishness against itself, and doing so in a way that is, shall we say, normative, not comparative. This is, I think, just another minor point that bears noting very, very briefly.
Which is a segue. I saw the play.
Oh, wow.
I saw the play you're going to go see tomorrow. And, Bret, it's what you're talking. The play itself, when you just see the play, it's offensive, it's disturbing, but you know what? Haaretz would write that play. Okay? what's very obnoxious and offensive is how that play came about. And so we were in London at a conference on international anti-Semitism, and we went to the Court Theater. And this play was written as a supplement, as an adjunct to another play. The Royal Court Theater had commissioned or had imported several German plays by modern German writers. And there was a play called The Stone. And it's a full-length drama, and it portrays how German parents and grandparents talk to their children and grandchildren about the Holocaust, how they hide it, how they camouflage it, how they subterfuge it. And it was Churchill who saw this and saw an opportunity to do a play. And the play is 7-8 minutes, and it's the juxtaposition of the play, which is, you know, when you see it, okay, big deal. You don't like the Israelis, fine. But it was the play, you see the Germans, how they hide the truth about the Holocaust, and now see the Israelis, how they hide the truth about Gaza and the Palestinians. That's the offensiveness. That is so outrageous. So when you see it tomorrow, you see it standing alone. Mm-hmm. Big deal.
I just want to say something about the question of Israel being held to a higher standard. Look, let's forget about the clear anti-Semites, the Ahmadinejads, and whoever else you want to put in that group. Let's just put them aside. There are still large groups of Jews and others who do hold Israel to a higher standard. And for good reason. Jews hold themselves to a higher standard for a good reason. That's what we're supposed to, that's what many of us, at least I, think that Jews should hold themselves to a higher standard. Israel is a Western democracy. And so as a Western democracy, we're not going to compare it to the Congo. I do take issue with the idea that there aren't many people who are working behind the scenes, many governments in Europe and elsewhere that are working, Scandinavian countries and others who are working very hard in very respectful ways to try to find solutions to the problems in Israel. So I just think it's, again, unfair to simplify the thing and say, well, it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel.
Well,
but nobody's. Hold on.
Whoa.
Go ahead, Dave. And then Brett.
The most frequently asked questions that I receive, usually in non-Jewish audiences, is, can't we criticize Israel and not be called an anti-Semite? Or can't we be anti-Zionist and not be called an anti-Semite? And the answer to the first question is absolutely, you can criticize Israel and not be called an anti-Semite. There's more criticism in Israel per square Jew, per square kilometer, than any other place in the world. Israel is a democracy. Be my guest, criticize it. But, I want to see you criticize and set the same standard elsewhere. And don't put on me, well, you Jews should be better. Because on that criteria, if what you don't care about, you don't set standards anywhere else in the world, you only set it to the Jewish people, that's a quick formula for suicide. So, sure, we set a standard for ourselves, and we want a higher standard. But no, not you. Look, when the boycott started in the churches and in universities, and the students said, we want to bring a measure of justice to the world. Wonderful. You want to bring it how? We want to boycott those institutions or those countries that don't have freedom of speech, don't respect for women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Wonderful. I'll give you a list of 20 countries. China, Saudi Arabia, Cuba, there's plenty of them. If you include Israel, I will argue with you to say Israel doesn't belong on that list. But you know what? If at the end of the day, in your effort to better the world, in the list of of all the countries that you can name very easily, you include Israel, I'd say, okay. But if the only country that you single out for boycott is Israel, that's anti-Semitism. Very, very clear. So let me finish the other part. Can you be anti-Zionist and not be an anti-Semite? Almost never. Unless you could prove to me that you are against nationalism. If you're one of those unique individuals in this world that is opposed to American nationalism, French nationalism, Palestinian nationalism, then you can be opposed to Jewish nationalism. Is it racist? You bet it is. Every nationalism is racist. It sets its laws of citizenship. It sets its own capital, which only Israel hasn't been able to determine its own capital for the rest of the world. But it sets its songs, it sets its values. It is, if you will, exclusive, and you can even call it racist. But if the only nationalism in the world, which is racism, is Jewish nationalism, you're an anti-Semite. And I don't want to make any apologies for it. It's very clear. Show me you're opposed to Palestinian nationalism, show me you're opposed to French nationalism, and you're opposed to Jewish nationalism, fine.
Yeah, let me add to something. I mean, first of all, criticism of Israel. Victor Lieberman may be about to become foreign minister. I'm appalled, okay? He's an appalling man. He should not be, he shouldn't even be in the mafia. I mean, so if that satisfies anyone out there who's wondering whether I will ever criticize Israel, there you had it, 17
affiliates.
But he's not Haider.
Okay. We'll get into that in a second. Another point that I think is worth mentioning, I think one of the most cogent criticisms of Walton Mearsheimer's book is here you had two guys who are foreign policy realists. What does that mean? A realist believes that countries operate in the international arena according to their national interests, right? That domestic politics ultimately does not affect statecraft when it comes to the rest of the world, okay? But here, these two realists discover the one exception to that rule, and that is the Jewish lobby or the Israel lobby, which is the tail wagging the proverbial dog. Let me give you another example, okay? We, as has been mentioned, and as this literature from outside shows, anti-Zionism is primarily become a phenomenon of the left. It's popular among campuses. It's a progressive idea. I remember once seeing a picture of an anti-Israel or protest in London where someone was holding a banner that said "Queers for Palestine." It was a very instructive banner because anyone who knows this much about the situation of homosexuals in the Palestinian Authority knows that they can be queers for Palestine, they don't want to be queers in Palestine. This is an important point, and I'm saying this to all the people who I heard hissing at one point, okay? If you support gay rights, you will not find a large gay rights parade in Damascus or in Cairo or in Riyadh. If you support women's rights, if you think women should have the right to settle on their careers, their choice of partner, they should be able to aspire to become prime minister, all the sort of panoply of rights that women enjoy and have struggled for in this country. If you support those rights, okay, again, don't look for them in Jordan. Don't look for them in elsewhere in the Arab world. The only country where this happens is in Israel. You believe that there ought to be a rule of law? Let us say that you're the president of the country and you commit a crime. Okay, Mubarak isn't going to jail for any crimes that he's committed, but Moshe Katsav probably will, and maybe Ehud Olmert will. And this is an astonishing testament to a country that believes in the rule of law, which is something that, as I understand it, is something liberals believe in. Go down the right, free press, artistic expression, all of these things that the left says it believes in, okay? And then they'll say, oh, but Israel is an illegitimate state. And objectively, therefore, Hamas, which would kill homosexuals, repress women, say that they're worth half a man, if not a quarter, are opposed to minority rights, and so forth and so on. And so what I'm saying there is, again, there is a hypocrisy, there is a contradiction. If you're going to tell me that you support these things, with one exception, Israel, then I have problems with that point of view. And this is a progressive case that needs to be made for Israel, not a conservative case.
Well, I agree with everything you said, but I just want to go back to the question, which is, why is Zionism a dirty word? Abe, you said earlier, in 1975, when Zionism is Racism came out, you had demonstrations everywhere, people wearing buttons saying, I am a Zionist. And you said, well, I doubt that would happen today. Now, back to the question, why wouldn't that happen today? Is it purely because Zionism has somehow become more of a dirty word, or is there any other reason? Is there anything that has happened in, I can remember clearly 1967, I was a second grader, and the country, my school, the country, and seemingly the world were euphoric. And that goes for a lot of places which later have changed their tune. As countries, as peoples, the tune has changed. Now, are you saying that you wouldn't find those demonstrations happening purely because somehow the Palestinians and their sympathizers have won the propaganda debate? Yeah. Or is there another real reason?
Or they've set a stigma. They have succeeded in putting a stigma on the term Zionism. And you know what? You just referred to 67 as this euphoric, Israel stood up in its defense. I'm going to take 3 minutes, and I'm going to talk to you about the Gaza war. What was Gaza? Here's Israel, voluntarily gave up the land, left the occupation, uprooted settlements voluntarily, destroyed synagogues, reburied its dead. Some good Jews, mostly probably in New York, raised $15 million to purchase the greenhouses, favos, so that 3,000 Palestinians in Gaza would, God forbid, not lose their livelihood for 3,000 families, because after all, Israel is leaving occupation. And so they bought it, handed it over to the Palestinians so that the Palestinians in Gaza could continue to provide livelihood for 3,000 families. Then you had an election, you had a coup in Gaza, and Israel stands by. It engages eventually in a negotiation for a ceasefire with an entity which says, I do not recognize you, you have no right to live, we will not recognize anything, and in its constitution says to kill Jewish men, women, and children. And still, this country, Israel, the same country as in 67, negotiates a ceasefire with its good friend Egypt. And a ceasefire holds for 6 months with some minor violation. And all this time, there's an Israeli soldier called Shalit, Gilad Shalit, not permitted by that wonderful entity who now negotiates to be visited by the Red Cross or anybody else. And then they decide one morning, no more ceasefire. And day by day, they increase the bombardment against Israel. I think it was McShane who said today, more rockets fell on Israel in that period than V rockets fell on London during the days of the Blitz. And yet Israel restrained and restrained and restrained. And every day, thousands of its men, women, and children, not soldiers, men, women, and children, had to go into hiding, etc. And then one day, Israel did in this winter what it did in 1967. It didn't even preempt. It went to defend its citizens. Oren, nothing changed from the Israelis. Nothing changed. They were restrained. They were hopeful for the world too. They didn't want to go out and shoot and kill. They wanted to live as they wanted to live in '67. You know what? Israel didn't change. The world changed.
Well, let me also try to answer Oren's question, because he made me think of this. It may, in fact, be the case, and your film might need to pick up on this, that from the world's perspective, Israel was created in 1982. There are very many people around the world that really have no sense of Israel's backstory, its history, its founding, the 3 wars fought against it. Israel, in the minds of many, many people around the world, is the view or the vision of a superpower, a powerful nation that subjugates the Arab world. We grew up at a different time. I'm your age. So yes, I was in 2nd grade too. In fact, I remember thinking about how there was a time that Zionism may not have been a dirty word. It was a good word. The plucky Israelis during the 6-Day War, the raid on Entebbe, right? There were reasons for people to feel good about Zionism. Even non-Jews said, wow, you know, those Israelis, my, they're incredible. Look what they do, defending themselves against hostile people. Something happened. The world changed in 1982 between the invasion of Lebanon and the settlement policies, and then the world forgot history or ignored history. And perhaps part of this difficulty is the vision that you're talking about. What's changed is that excuse me, the sympathy for Zionism and the sympathy for the post-Holocaust Jewish world has completely evaporated. And now what we see is the superpower bad guy Israeli who occupies another country.
Look, but who is the world? What is the world? I mean, Zionism, believe it or not, has a lot of people who support it, who don't think it's a dirty word. They're most Israelis. There are most American Jews, I would say. There are most Americans, in fact, will say, you know, do you support Israel? Yes. And you don't need to get into the finer distinctions of Israel versus Zionism or whatever. That's what they mean. So who changed? What changed? In effect, the left changed. This is the basic point. Somehow the left went from admiring Israel, the land of the kibbutzim, of socialist enterprise, plucky little Israel, the David state facing its Goliath enemies, to a completely different picture. I mean, the right also changed. The right, on the whole, became more pro-Israel in a variety of ways, but that's what happened. But what basically changed is polite society did, or the intelligentsia changed, or the academy changed. So the world, it's really kind of the world as we know it within these four walls. And that's, I think, what really needs to be examined. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but this is the argument that really needs to be made. The argument that needs to be engaged is the liberal case for Israel. You know, and just one point that you had made Israel a bit earlier about Israel. You'd said, well, this is a Western democracy. This is a Western democracy that has been under siege for 61 years. Okay? It has not had secure borders for its entire existence. So if you're going to judge Israel, as I said, don't judge it normatively according to some standard of what a Western democracy is or what the Jewish people should be. Judge it according to the standards of what other Western democracies have done faced with similar challenges. And I would ask you, look at what France did during the Algeria crisis, which was not a crisis really within it. I mean, not really. Okay, Algeria was, quote, it was a department of France, but it wasn't really inside. And look at what the French did. Ask yourself about Britain with respect to Northern Ireland. These are the comparisons that don't compare Israel to Switzerland. You know, Switzerland is fine. Everyone puts their money there illegally. Everyone likes the country. Beautiful little, it's a beautiful spot.
Great cows.
It has no threats. It has no enemies. Okay, so don't compare it to Switzerland. Compare it to the way other Western democracies have behaved under similar circumstances.
Before we take some questions from our audience and our affiliates watching in other remote cities, I was struck by an article yesterday about a military engagement in Afghanistan. The United States apparently was going after some terrorists in a house, and I think 5 civilians were killed. And it's a tragedy for the Afghani people. And it was remarkable that you don't read about it in the same way. Very similar idea. They went into a home, 3 children were killed. Must have made them, they still haven't decided whether they made a mistake, whether they located the same house or not, right? But it just has it does seem strange or curious that people don't respond to it in the same way. The number of civilians that were killed in Afghanistan by our own military seems to have no traction in a similar way and does raise some questions of paradox and moral hypocrisy. This question comes from Greensboro. Hello, Greensboro. Where have we failed in terms of public relations to present Zionism and the modern-day state of Israel in an honest and positive fashion? Is there a failure of communication? One of the things I was hinting at before, I suspect, although Bret had an interesting response, is that somehow we've allowed the world, we've capitulated to the idea that Israel is just a superpower bad guys. And that it's not about all the other things that Israel has historically been about. And that perhaps even in good faith, we've somehow not presented the message that was so pervasive when you and I were in 2nd grade. Anyone, is this a failure of politics? Is this a failure of Madison Avenue? Is this simply anti-Semitism overriding the historical record?
The answer is yes.
Well, I would just say that just to go back to 2nd grade, it's a time I wish we could recreate. First of all, I hate the fact that on this panel, I am somehow over here on the left.
Well, sorry, you're not going to get any fruit cup when this is over.
Because, obviously, I'm making a film called The Zionist Idea, which, by the way, is based on Arthur Hertzberg's key book, which is a compilation of Zionist thinking. It's an incredible, wonderful book. I am, was very influenced by Hertzberg and by my father and grandfather and their families, who were very active in the Zionist cause, as am I. And I grew up with those images, those very effective, very compelling images of the Jews draining, these Palestinian Jews draining the swamps and building this incredible country. I was very affected by the image of Moshe Dayan, a completely secular Jew, coming into Jerusalem and at the Wailing Wall, and yet, of course, I'm troubled by the very fact that Zionism has become a dirty word. That's the whole reason I'm making this film. But I'm just trying to, unfortunately, there's nobody else who maybe speaks more eloquently, but to maybe give a different perspective. So I think, yes, it is a failure of propaganda or that mythology is gone. Nobody remembers those images. I mean, Israel has become a modern capitalist, very successful capitalist, in the best sense of the word, Western democracy.
Well, the answer to Greensboro is there are very few people defending Zionism. There used to be Zionists defending Zionism, and in a certain way, in a good way, they disappeared. After the 67, before the 67 war, at least I'm speaking about American Jewish community, there were Zionists and non-Zionists, or a-Zionists. With the threat in 67 towards Israel, as it was growing, and Eban traveled the capitals of the world with his attaché case, and nobody responded. The barriers, the differentiation between Zionists and non-Zionists in this country disappeared, which everybody came out as supporters of Israel. In one way, it was wonderful. It was good, because beforehand, only Zionists supported Israel, and if you weren't a Zionist, you weren't. So now, American Jews were supporting Israel. But it dissipated the Zionist movement. you don't have a significant Zionist movement. So there's nobody out there really defending the name, the value. We defend Israel. Now, are we failing on Israel? No. We can always do better. Israel can always do better. Israel is learning every day. It's much better. It learned from the Lebanon War a lot of lessons how to better. But at the end of the day, when media news is controlled and fed out the way it is from Al Jazeera, no amount of good media can, and PR and branding and whatever you want to call it, will offset an image shown 24 times a day of a mother holding a dead child. And what makes it even worse is, I don't know how many of you remember, every war has a moment at which the world forces Israel to agree to a ceasefire, whether Israel is ready to agree to a ceasefire or not. In the Lebanon War, it was a shell in a town. This war, in the Gaza War, it was ostensibly an Israeli shell that fell into a United Nations school. That was the moment. Headlines in London were school massacre. It was all over the media as I heard as 44 people died. Now, as it turns out, 2 weeks later, nicht gestiegen and nicht geflogen. The school was not a school. Certainly wasn't a school then. The shell did not fall into the building. The shell fell outside. So it wasn't school children that were killed in the school. Now, there were 14 deaths. Very tragic, very serious, very significant, not 44. But the world, the image was for days and weeks in all the media of the world, not only Al Jazeera, but in the London Times and the New York Times, what? That the Israelis did it again. They shelled a United Nations school, killed 44 innocent, many of them children. Now, how do you fix it? How do you fix it? You know what I'm doing? I'm spending time, we're doing the research, where it appeared and what size and what page, because today with the internet, everything looks the same. But when you take a newspaper and it's on a front page in big, bold letters, and we will write letters to all these newspapers asking for a correction and a retraction. Not that it will change history.
Well, I think that there's a problem of rhetoric. Having been in Israel and doing these deals on CNN where you're sort of twinned with Saeb Erekat or someone who's in Ramallah, kind of learned this. Basically, when Israelis go head-to-head, or Israeli spokesmen go head-to-head with Palestinian spokesmen, the argument goes like this. The Israeli says, you Palestinians are committing terrorism. Palestinian says, very regrettable. We condemn violence in all of its forms. On the other hand, you stole our land. That's the argument. And in that argument, it's an argument that pits means against ends. And that argument will always fall on the side of the people making the argument about ends. The argument ought to be, and this I owe to Ruth Weiss, wonderful professor at Harvard. This came up with the whole question of proportionality in Gaza. She said, where's the proportion? Hamas's goal is to wipe Israel off the map and wipe the Jews out of Israel. There isn't even a concept of Jews remaining there as citizens in an equal state. Where is the proportion? Was Israel's intention to wipe Gaza off the map? It's well within Israel's capabilities, by the way, to have killed every single Palestinian in Gaza. They could easily have done it. Do you think that if those capabilities were in the hands of Hamas, there would be a Jew alive in Israel today? So this is what really needs, the point that needs to be made. That what Israelis are fighting for is to defend a state in some, and live in peace in whatever the borders are. What Hamas is fighting for is to destroy Israel, to wipe it out entirely. And they're very open about that. I mean, and sometimes I'm grateful to Hamas because they are in their own perverse way, they're perfectly honest about their intentions. Arafat, I think, shared those intentions, but was somewhat less honest about it. But Hamas provides its own literature, and that ought to be the constant refrain of people who are making the case for Israel. By all means, let's have a territorial dispute. I would love it if this argument were really about occupation. Because if it were about occupation, I would be 100% for getting out every single settler tomorrow, if that were really the case. But I think what we've discovered in the last 8 or 9 years is we're not arguing about 1967, we're arguing about 1948, which goes back to the point that Abe was making about Zionism. This is why a new defense of Zionism is needed, because the real argument that's being waged intellectually is whether there is such a thing as a legitimate Jewish nationalism. And I would argue that there is. Hello, Greensboro.
All right, Greensboro. Atlanta, your question has already been answered. Hello, Atlanta, by the way. I love your rabbi.
There's just one?
Well, I think they're at the temple. How do we defend Zionism? This is the Atlanta question that's been answered. How do we defend Zionism when the media continues to show wounded Palestinian children on the front page and very little mention of Israeli suffering? Here's Pittsburgh. Hi, Pittsburgh. What is the most helpful action that President Obama and/or Secretary Clinton could take in improving the situation in Israel? Let's talk. Maybe Bret, you should begin. You are a global affairs columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Do you have any advice if either Hillary or Barack called you tonight? I think they're watching remotely. By the way.
Very remote.
Well, if they are watching remotely, then I'm really worried. Look, I would advise them to take the Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm. Everyone wants a settlement between Israelis and Palestinians. And that goes for me as a lunatic neocon columnist as much as it does for the people protesting outside. The question is whether the conditions exist to reach a settlement. Now,
But you also can't want it more than they want it, than the parties themselves want it.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
That's an important point. I mean, right now, Hamas and Fatah are in negotiations to form a kind of coalition government, which would make Hamas kosher, if you will, within the Palestinian Authority. Mohammed Dakhlan, who used to be the kind of go-to guy for the Clinton administration, he was a lieutenant of Arafat's, he was a leader of one of the so-called Young Hawks in Fatah, made a comment last week, which I thought was a stunning comment. He said that his advice to Hamas was that it should never recognize Israel, and besides which, Fatah had never recognized Israel. That is, the party that all along we've been told is the moderate party that's ready to make an accommodation with Israel. Now, to some extent, that's an expression of Dakhlan's own efforts to work his way back into the good graces of the Palestinian public. But it's also a rather revealing, it gives you a sort of, it's a revelation about where Palestinians stand, including, not just Hamas, but including the moderate wing, vis-a-vis the idea of reaching a genuine accommodation, a two-state solution with Israel. So again, I come back to my comment about the Obama administration. Do no harm. Do not, as Abe said, don't try to force an agreement where there is no basis for one.
A question from Omaha. The Palestinians have grown up with a different narrative about the creation of the Jewish state, Nakba, and the, quote, occupation. How do we get past these interpretations to reach agreement with them? The whole notion of reciprocal grievances, the very disparate storytelling that is told in Israel versus the storytelling that's told in the Arab world. I mean, one of the things I suspect that's being intimated here in Omaha is this in some ways irreconcilable? Both people have a dramatically different vision of how they got to where they are. Both people have an enormous sense of historical grievance, whether it's olive trees or whether it's people who were blown up in a Tel Aviv pizza shop. And that it's almost in some ways intractable.
Well, since we're in a panel defending Zionism, I want to quote a great Zionist from Milwaukee, Golda Meir, who taught us a lot of things, which maybe we need to remind ourselves now. First of all, she said, Jews do not have the luxury of being pessimists. This question is pessimistic. And so I think all of us are optimists. And she gave two, if you will, conditions, seductively very simple, for peace to come about. She said, one, I can forgive the Arabs, she didn't say Palestinians, for killing my sons. I can't forgive them for forcing my sons to kill their sons. Now, if that concept would begin to take shape in the mothers of Palestine, as it did in other places in the world, the mothers in Ireland and in other places. But finally, she said, peace will come when Palestinian mothers love their children more than they hate our children. Now, I believe that's possible. How it will start, where it will start with leadership that has the strength to stand up and to say no to hate. Abbas, we thought, is one of them. Maybe not. Fayyad, we thought, is more one that would. Now he's ready to step aside. But I believe there will come a Palestinian leader that will teach, not the narrative, but to love your children more than you hate your enemy's children. Because the tragedy is, we can sit here, left, right, middle, whatever you want, even with the people outside, and we can lay out in 15 minutes the settlement. We all know what the settlement will be, but there's one ingredient missing. Both sides need to be able to say, I recognize your right to live. And meanwhile, we don't have that. I believe it will come, hopefully in my lifetime, if not in my children or grandchildren's lifetime.
Oren, I wonder if that troubles you, because that goes back to a different moral standard again. I was thinking about when Abe was talking, and earlier as well, the Steven Spielberg film Munich, which was written by Tony Kushner. Many people, Jews and Palestinians, objected to the film, and I wrote about that. Wrote an op-ed about that film. And one of the things I said was that what the film does seem to show is that Israelis feel anguish over killing. They can't even digest their meals. Even the assassins who know they have to kill fight with one another. There's a tremendous amount of ambivalence and conflict and doubt, and the Palestinians are seen as glorifying in what they do without any sense of apology. And that was considered a different perspective, but again, it raises this idea that the Jews on some levels are being held, or they hold themselves to a different moral standard. And I don't know if that's troubling, given what you said earlier, Oren. I'll let you answer that quickly, and then I want to take one final question from our New York audience, and I want to say goodnight to everybody. So, Oren, if you can quickly...
Well, I don't know if I can exactly address that question. I do want to say, speaking from an optimistic place, that the world, with the exception, the major, huge exception of Iran and a few other countries, the world has changed for Israel. In 1967, there were few Arab countries who had diplomatic relations with Israel. Things looked pretty grim. Today, whether you think their motives are evil or good, Israel does have a peace treaty with Egypt, with Jordan. The Saudis have proposed peace plans that don't call for the destruction of the state. Abbas, the same. There are plans on the table that many Palestinians, many Arab countries, and others would agree to, which recognizes Israel's right to exist. So from that perspective, we've come a long way. If any of us remember, which most of us do, Rabin's funeral, the leader of Jordan was there making a speech to his friend Rabin. The world has changed dramatically from earlier days. At the same time, there's a potential nuclear threat and enemies within. So I know we have to cut it
No,
short.
no.
So,
Can I just make one?
Yeah, and then I want to get this New York.
I just want to make a very brief point in reference to some of what you said about Palestinian mothers. I'm pretty sure that 99.9% of Palestinian mothers love their children more than they hate Israelis. Now, that doesn't mean that there is...
Be permitted to.
But let me tell you something. You know, case study in suicide bombing. A 12-year-old mentally retarded boy is fitted with a suicide vest and told to go out from Tulkarm, or I forgot where, and go blow himself up at a checkpoint. A Palestinian woman who apparently had been involved in an adulterous affair with another man is caught, and in order to sort of remove the stain on family honor, decides to become a shaheed. You investigate the story of a lot of these suicide bombers. They turn out they're drug addicts, social outcasts of one kind or another, whom deeply evil men who have no intention of committing suicide themselves force to become bombers. Now, is this true of people like Mohammed Atta? Absolutely not. There were cadres, especially at the beginning of the Intifada in Israel, and then in other cases where it was an elite that became the kind of the kamikazes of their day. But on the whole, you look at the profile of a lot of suicide bombers, and it turns out that they're social outcasts who use this as a kind of escape. And that should point, I mean, what I'm saying is, we're not talking about we're confronting this culture, this wall-to-wall culture of hate. We are confronting cultures that have been captured by profoundly evil individuals in Hamas, in Palestine Islamic Jihad, in a number of other, you look out, it goes far afield to Pakistan, you look at what's happening in Swat today. These aren't, cultures where somehow the ordinary laws of biological nature, mothers loving their children, have ceased to operate. These are cultures that are in the grip of evil people. This happened in Europe as well. It happened in Germany in the 1930s. There have been other instances of this. We are making a mistake to say that there is a fundamental clash of civilizations, a law of cultures or narratives. We're talking about political circumstances that can be dealt with through ordinary means.
Final question. This comes from New York, and it really can require a yes or no answer. Will Israel exist in 50 years? Oren?
Absolutely it will, and it will thrive, and it will have a peace treaty with its Palestinian neighbors.
Mr. Stephens? No question?
Well, there's no question.
Absolutely no question.
So you should be relieved, Mr. New Yorker. Thank you. Some concluding remarks. I'm sorry, our evening, this fascinating evening, will have to come to an end. Let me first thank all of you and for our 17 cities for participating in this very eventful, interesting, and engaging evening. Thank you all. We should definitely thank Mr. Marty Maskowitz, who you just met a moment ago, and his colleague Asher Curran, who do the programming here for the Bronfman Center of the 92nd Street Y. For those of you who've been coming to the series that I had this year, thank you very much for coming to a number of them. We'll be back next year with another series of fascinating guests. Abe Foxman will be able to sign books outside. I want to thank Oren Rudavsky, Bret Stephens, and Abe Foxman. Thank you and good night.